the recording. There we
Can
go.
you give a reminder?
Yes,
There it is.
recording now.
No, there it is.
Perfect. There we go. There we go. My session on peacefully finding your way through trauma. The plan of today, if you're not on mute, if you could put yourself on mute, any questions that you may have, we'll save some time at the end. If there's anything pressing, please put it on the chat. And Jen has kindly agreed to monitor that for me. So today is about trauma. And this is really for anyone that's gone through trauma, anyone that you know. The truth of it is, through this pandemic, trauma has impacted us all in some form of way. So the idea of today is covering what is trauma, looking at ways how it may manifest and steps on moving on. Because I think that's the key thing is, we've all got something we've been through in life, but actually, how do we move from it? So I'm going to talk about myself, just give everybody a bit of context about who I am. So my name is Gemma Watson. My working experience comes from education and social care. So I work with a lot of young people who live traumatic lives, and I've supported them in a pastoral and safeguarding context, equally the same in social care. But I am in my mid-30s. I like to classify myself as a young lady that loves life. I live by my principles and my values, but however, that was not always the case. I was born in 1984, and it's been an interesting road, to say the least. My biological mum, suffered from mental health illnesses. She engaged in drug and prostitution activities, which led me not to grow up with her. Growing up, I suffered an array of different types of abuse, and grew up with, different broken relationships around me. And this led me to really become emotionally cut off from the world. And without realizing it, I had got to a place where I didn't express my emotions. And it took a lot of work. And I guess, through that work is why I'm here delivering this session to you guys now. So trauma, what is trauma? I classify it as a thing that we call life. That's what we say. Oh, it's just something that's happened to me, but it comes in different forms. COVID, that's the biggest pandemic that we've had. And that's a trauma. That's an adjustment. That is one of the traumas. Bereavement, survivorship, care and responsibilities, abuse or neglect, looking at household or family adversity. These are things that we look over because we think that these are things that are just normal, but actually they're very traumatic in our life. And it's important that, growing up, I never looked at my life as trauma, but actually until I did, and then realized that working with it, getting the support you need is really important. Now, trauma manifests in different ways. For everybody, it's going to be different. And I want to go through some of that. Now, as we know, as a child, the brain is developing. Now, that affects us different ways in our emotions, our relationships, our behavior, our brain development. And I'm going to go into a slide shortly about our brain development so you can see the difference with someone that has grown up without trauma to someone that has grown up with trauma. But when you look at here and you see how it impacts sleep disorders, things that people ultimately think are normal. A lot of people say, oh, I don't normally sleep. Actually, why do you not normally sleep? Because the body needs sleep. The body needs to rest. It needs to recuperate. You look at behavior, aggression. Sometimes when we see people, we just think that they're angry. Why are you so angry? There could be a reason, not all the time, but there could be a reason, risk taking, especially in the lives of our young people. This is something we've really got to be mindful. Actually, is this because trauma that they've suffered at an early age and themselves haven't realized? Again, thinking it's just part of life. I'm going to go on to, looking at the brains. So I hope you guys can see this. Thumbs up if you can. So on the left, you've got a healthy brain. And on the right, you've got an abused brain. And as you can see, you've got different colors for different parts, but the black parts are where it's least active, the black and purple parts where it's least active. And it's important that when we are looking at people that have gone through trauma, understanding the brain chemistry and the change of that. and actually realizing that sometimes the way it manifests our actions, our behaviors, is not necessarily our fault, because actually what happens is, it changes your perception, which will go on, changes your thinking styles. Again, I'll touch on that a bit later. But I just kind of wanted to take a few moments just so you can see the difference between, a healthy brain and abused brain. And this is something, in terms of the work I do with a lot of young people, showing this is so impactful, because actually when they see that, the truth of it is, unless you've gone and got yourself examined, you're not going to know. But when they understand the impact of what life sometimes can bear, that's when we can start doing that healing work. I'm saying for adults, because I also coach some adults. And again, this has really been really powerful. I'm going to move on and talk about some of the ways that it manifests. I'm going to start with unhelpful thinking styles. Now, I didn't know this until I started learning about it, but there's 11 thinking styles that we tend to engage in. And the truth of it is, there's no right or wrong way, but when they become hindrance, we call them unhelpful thinking styles. Now, I want to just go through some that a lot of people tend to engage in a lot. So we've got mental filters, jumping to conclusions. Sometimes, again, trauma jades our perspective. And it's really important that sometimes when we're going through or when we're communicating with people, and for example, if we're jumping to conclusions, sometimes it's not really about what the person's done. That's how we communicate it. But actually, sometimes the conclusions we jump to is generally linked to the life that we've experienced. And sometimes when we see similarities, it leads us to jump to that conclusion. Personalizing a situation towards yourself, that is a key thing to look out. Anybody that you tend to find that you're talking about something and then they go, yeah, I get it, and they move on to themselves. Often, sometimes it's them projecting, sometimes it's them identifying, but that is a key one there. Rigid rule keeping, this is something I talk about a lot. Sometimes with this thinking style, we think that it's us putting boundaries in place, and we think that this is us being clear to everybody, but actually your rules are your rules. Your rules are going to be, made up because of your thinking style, your perspective, and your life experiences. So the truth of it is, the rules that you keep, they're likely to be broken by somebody else. And these are things that when we're working through trauma, we're looking at trauma, we break this down and really think about, actually, these rule keeping, is it boundaries, or actually is it to keep you safe? Because often that's when why we put these rules in place. Deletions, a key one. An average person, I think it's 80% the brain deletes of the things around us. So you can imagine, if the brain is deleting 80% of what's said, the things we see, actually, you have to wonder, in your normal interactions, how many things has your brain deleted without you realizing? When I look at trauma, we talk about conflict in communication. That's both in friendships and romantic relationships. And a key thing is, you always find that you ask somebody, have you been in a situation where someone says you did say something or you didn't, but you're adamant that this isn't the case? And actually they've found some sort of proof, whether it was a text message or an email at work, and it turns out that you was told or you did say something. And actually what's happened is your brain has deleted it. For whatever reason, your brain's deleted it. And often these are things that cause conflicts, because when we understand that 80% is what, on average, our brain deletes, we understand that, if someone's told us that we've done something, actually, how can we move forward, rather than sticking on it and going, I did or I didn't. Last one I'll touch on really quickly is black or white thinking. It's either this or it's either that. Now, that works for some people, and it doesn't mean to say that it's not a good thinking style to adopt, but it is realizing, actually, when could this be hindering me? Sometimes being in group situations, or, someone not understanding the way you're explaining, doesn't mean that you're right. When I think of this, I think of the image, and I don't know if anyone's seen this, but I think of an image where you've got two people standing either side, and you've got a 6. Well, one person says it's a 6 and one person says it's a 9. And that exactly is black or white thinking. One person saying, no, it's not, it's a 6, and the other person saying it's a 9. So just want to take a quick moment just to ask you guys, you don't need to say, if you want to put it in chat, by all means, but just think about, during this pandemic, which of these unhelpful thinking styles have you engaged in? Just think about, when is these unhelpful thinking styles maybe hindered some of the relationships, or friendships that you may have had. And thinking about the people around you that potentially are going through a traumatic experience, or have actually, what thinking styles they've exhibited in the past or during this time for you. I'll go on to beliefs now. Now, this is really interesting because with trauma, as I said, it really impacts our perspective. And often when you've gone through multiple traumas, it creates limited belief. Now, we all have limited belief. This is something that actually, I don't think anybody can get away from having. However, when you've got limiting beliefs that actually start hindering you, stop you from moving in your business goals, stop you from completing the assignment, these are, beliefs that actually are becoming a problem. And here, if you look, you've got beliefs, but in the middle of beliefs, there's actually the word lie. And I always point this out when I'm dealing with trauma, because actually that's the beauty of it, is you need to work out, what beliefs do you have that are actually lies? They're not true. Sometimes, especially when you've gone through trauma in your life, you say, I can't do this. I'm not good enough. But that's not true. That's a lie. Something you've told yourself, or someone's told you that, but it's not true. So, beliefs in a nutshell, they're just thoughts that we have about ourselves, others, the world, and as it says here, they can either hinder you or empower us. Beliefs are not all bad. And actually, when you change your perspective, they can be very empowering. And I can definitely say for myself, I used to have a lot of limiting beliefs. I remember, I'll show you now actually, about 5, 6 years ago, these were my top 2. And as you look at that, I want you to really think about 2 limiting beliefs that you currently have. Mine was, I look too young. I had, ambitions of starting a business. And no matter how I wore my hair, no matter what I did, it would never change. No matter what makeup I put on, it just looked like a little girl trying to look older. And then I used to think that I didn't have enough qualifications. Now, because I've had, various traumatic experiences, I didn't necessarily go down the route of finishing school, having really good grades, going on to 6th form. In fact, my college, I did my A-levels and my college closed down. And then I was left with half of an AS level. They didn't place me. So I grew up thinking, actually, is this it? I didn't have the option to, study. But the truth of it is, when I turned my perception and said, well, actually, I can still study, in different ways. And I don't have that belief. So just think about the beliefs that you currently have and try to think back as far as you can. Where did that come from? Was you told? What made you say this about yourself?
There are a few comments. If you wanted to have a look, or I can just say, Simi has asked, can you touch more on mental filters, please?
Of course. So mental filters, really, that's a thinking style. Again, as I said, with trauma, you have your own perspective. So for example, I'll give you an example. What happens a lot in relationships, and someone's gone through a relationship, and majority of the time their partners cheat. What that does, it creates a mental filter in your brain that if you see a pattern of behavior, you believe that this is going to happen. So your brain filters that information from the experiences that you've gone through, and then it presents as this is it. So what happens is, if, for example, you're now with a new person and you start to see similar, not necessarily the same, but similar, what your brain does, it almost has its own calculation. So it then says, okay, well, I've seen such and such before, this is going to be the end result. And then what happens with that is, because we've gone through that experience, our actions and reactions actually become defensive, because that's the way our brain has processed that information and created that mental filter. And actually it could be a situation, for whatever reason, that, you know, the behaviors look similar, that might be further from the truth. And it actually may be that in the idea that you're now becoming defensive because that's how you read it, that could end up resulting to the spouse cheating. But actually at that particular time, that was not the case. So hopefully I've explained that well enough. It's just really when you've got a series of experiences that you've gone through, how your brain processes it, and then it just creates a mental filter on how it processes that one particular event. Does that help, Simi?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Was there any more, Jen?
There's some more comments in the chat. There's jumping to conclusions. That's from Davika. Okay. And then Simi's also added personalization and deletions. And she says, I'm too young, men can't be trusted.
So
those last two are my limiting belief.
Oh, okay. So it's funny you say that, because men can't be trusted. And actually, I get the same from when men say women can't be trusted. Now, again, it's all about turning the perspective. So what I say to you is, if I asked you, can you be trusted? You would say yes. So if we take the perspective of, are you the only woman on the planet that can be trusted? Does that mean that there's no other men that can be trusted? Because it's very unlikely. And it's just that they haven't come into contact with yourself. And that's the truth of it. But again, when we look at trust, and this is important in terms of trauma, when we look at trust is not always just about wanting trust, but also sometimes about receiving trust. Because sometimes, you know, that saying, the truth hurts. And sometimes with trauma, you know, you don't necessarily gain the skills on how to communicate effectively. And as simple as that, I find this a lot with men, is that because of the things they've gone through, they've now created a lot of mental filters. You do find mental filters with a lot of men. And then they go, okay, well, I'm not going to do that, because actually it's going to unleash a can of worms. Now, there is nothing going on, but for the simple fact that because they've had that experience more than once, they've now told themselves that's always going to happen. And this is where, unhelpful thinking styles, when you can identify it in someone else, because they might not know, they might not be privy to this. So when you can identify it in someone else, actually you can extend that compassion, that empathy.
Yeah. It's strange, actually, you should say that. I noticed that behavior in one of my sons. You know, the deletion thing.
Do you know what? It's funny, until I actually learned about that, and I learned about that more so on the neuroscience things of things I studied, and I didn't realize. I always knew it was really high, but I didn't know. And actually, when you look at emotional intelligence, that also has a huge focus on deletion of the brain. And it's even during this pandemic. Could you imagine, with the worry that we felt? Imagine if our brain didn't delete most of that information. We'd all be in a corner somewhere.
I know, going crazy.
Absolutely, not being able to carry on. And that's what the brain does. And the brain has a way of, and always, I remind myself this daily, the brain has a way that it believes that it's keeping you safe. So it deletes it, because what it's saying is, I'm keeping you safe by deleting this information. Because even if it's just good information, to process it all, it's a lot of pressure on the brain. And that's why you get things like headaches, migraines, because it's all pressure. And again, being aware of it, because I think you can't necessarily stop that. There's a lot of people, that talk about mindset and mind hacking, but I think once you're aware that actually your brain deletes close to 80%, the truth of it is, when someone's saying to you, well, you could have, or maybe you did this, instead of going, no, I didn't, and arguing and causing the conflict, actually just going, do you know what, I don't remember, but in future, such and such. And actually that de-escalates it, and when I do a lot of the work in terms of my coaching, I always say that it's about building and restoring, not breaking down. And actually, having a mental filter, you know, actually breaks down those relationships and breaks down that communication. And if we're, you know, true to our values, and that's why I said it at the beginning, when you're true to your values, a lot of people say, I value family, but you value family and you say it, but actually does that show in your actions? Because when you value someone else's opinion, if they've said to you, you've said something, then actually how can you de-escalate that? You know, but it's not until you hear it sometimes do you go, that makes sense to me. I think there was something from Davika, wasn't there, Jen?
Yes, Davika has said jump into conclusions.
Yes. So now they always talk about women's intuitions, and I do definitely agree with that to a degree. But equally, you know, it's really important. The truth of it is, as I said, perception sometimes isn't fact. You know, and you know they always say perspective isn't necessarily reality. It could be our reality, and that could be, you know, the mental filter that we've built for ourselves. But actually, you know, when you jump to a conclusion, to the other person, when you speak to the other person and say, how did you make that feel? Often people describe it that their heart crushed 10 times over. You know, and if you've ever been in a situation where someone's jumped to conclusions, you know, it's that thought of, why didn't you tell me? Had you have told me, I would have set the record straight. Again, that crushing feeling. And was there something in particular you wanted to ask Davika?
No. I mean, I was just looking at the last slide where you were saying, what have you seen in people? And I think it is very common to, you know, not asking people for clarification.
Yes.
And just saying, okay, this is what I think that they mean. And then, you know, just going from there kind of a thing. So not being patient and not trying to understand other people's perspective. And sometimes you can be really surprised by what you realize, like once they tell you what they meant, you know.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think that's the key thing when it comes to jumping to conclusions, is really taking the step back to breathe. You know, sometimes we want to have a conversation right then and there, but actually sometimes in order to look at it from an objective standpoint, actually, and this is where, you know, when we understand going through traumatic experiences and we understand that while it is life experiences, understanding that changes the way we view the world, it does change the way we think. When we understand that, actually what we're able to do is go, do you know what, maybe this is a conversation that I just need to take a few steps back and just ask, as you said, ask that question. I think it's really important to ask. And sometimes, you know, with a mental filter, we ask the question, but sometimes we don't take the response. And it's the same with jumping to conclusions. And it's important that actually we understand, you know, is that a thinking style that I adopt? And if I do, actually, could I be jumping to conclusions? And sometimes being caught up with the case of if you are and if you're not, sometimes it's just not helpful. Just actually look about how you can move on. I'm gonna move on. I created throughout this pandemic, I was looking at, you know, trauma in great detail. And because the pandemic did, you know, it gave us adjustment, bereavement, but also survivorship. So it actually, in one pandemic, there was, you know, and then we had a higher rise of domestic violence. So I really sat and I really thought about trauma, and I came up with 5 things that I call soul destroyers. And they're really things that I believe break down our life, our family, our relationships, the interactions we have, and sometimes our opportunities. And the first one is a lack of accountability. You know, sometimes, and I heard this a lot over this period actually, sometimes we say, oh, this has happened, so I can't do this. Actually, where can you take accountability? You know, whether you be at work, whether you're in, you know, in the context of your relationship. And this is something that we often as adults want our young people to do. But actually, if we look and take a stop as adults, we forget to do this. You know, I make a point with the work I do with young people. Sometimes I get it wrong, and I make sure I always go back, or sometimes I say, do you know what, didn't know that. And it's important that we're doing that, because actually, where can we take accountability? You know, actually, some people in this time have said, oh, I was looking to start a business. Oh, well, I'm not going to do it this year because we had COVID. But actually, what happens next year? There's going to be something else. There's always something else in our life. And it's about taking the accountability. And actually, when you take accountability, it's so empowering. The next one, conformity. You know, when we look at trauma, and I could definitely speak about, you know, this was so true for me. When you've gone through a lot of trauma, you create this force around you that you create it to protect yourself. But actually, you really are doing is you want people to be a certain way, act a certain way, talk a certain way, so you can understand them. And actually, you know, this kind of links to rigid rule keeping, because you think I'm putting boundaries in place. But actually, what you're really saying is, I want you to conform with my ideologies. I want you to conform with the way or the view I have for you. And it's really important. There are really fine lines when you look at conformity. You know, when we look at the young people who live traumatic lives, you think of the violence that, you know, some of these young people see, even just from seeing on social media going around. A lot of them are conforming and not even realizing that actually they're going through trauma, you know, in their young age. The next one, keeping score. I classify this as, you know, making a mental note of, you know, in the idea of relationships, this could be who does the dishes more, or who initiates to go out more. You know, in your friendships, who makes the contact more. And what we don't realize is that everybody has different things going on in their life. And I say that if your focus is on keeping score, your focus isn't actually in the friendship. Your focus isn't in the relationship. Because the truth of it is, when you're able to find things that you can appreciate, then you're actually able to, you know, look at what is there rather than what's not. The next one, defensiveness. Now, this is a big one. This comes from, you know, trauma. It makes us defensive, you know, and it's all about keeping us safe. But again, all that does, I always say that a lot of our actions and reactions, 9 times out of 10, is a reaction to how someone else has acted. And that person's reaction is a reaction to our reaction. And it ends up being this vicious cycle. And actually, we have to start saying, where can we stop and just go, is there any defensiveness here? I remember being asked one month within a job role, and I was asked, why have I taken this role and not the next level up? Now, straight away, my mind went into, are you saying I'm not good at the job? When actually, it was a conversation that turned out for me to get a promotion. And that was because of the limited beliefs I had. I couldn't see past somebody can't compliment. And actually, sometimes when people are defensive, you have to wonder, why are they defensive? You know, we internalize a lot of our experiences. And because we internalize them, we don't talk about it. We just see a person as being defensive, which in turn sometimes rude. But there's always a root cause to our behavior. I always say it is this behavior is disclosing actions. And then the last one, procrastination. Now, I think it's fair to say most people, I can definitely put my hands up, we at some point suffer from procrastination. But it's really understanding when it is hindering, you know, when it stops you from getting that assignment on time, when it stops you from meeting a deadline, when it stops you from achieving the business goals or the opportunity that's knocking on the door. These are things that we must, you know, really pay attention to and actually think, is this destroying our soul? Because actually, in plain words, how I look at it is that it stops us from reaching and unleashing that power, which I'll go on to shortly. So while I've talked about, you know, different traumas and the impact of that, I'd like to talk about moving on, because I think that's the key thing, because we've all got a story and we've all gone through some form of trauma. Now, for me, I always say that the first step is being kind to yourself. Be kind, it will take time. The second part is create steps. Now, in the coaching that I do, I created some steps that I find that break down this process. The first part is about awareness, because you can't change what you're not aware of. It's impossible. So the first part is all about discovering, not just discovering more about the trauma, but also discovering, how is this manifested in yourself? How is this manifested in the people around you? Then we move on to acknowledgement. You look at acknowledgement. Yes, acknowledging what's happened, also taking the ownership, because often when things have happened to us, you know, there is the element that we take that on board, and we create those mental filters, we jump to conclusions. And then we also look at setting intentions. You know, in the idea of our friendships or relationships, sometimes we, in a conversation, the intention that we had, or you go in to speak to your boss, you had an intention, this was going to happen. And actually, because of someone else's reaction, the intention we started with wasn't what we ended up with. So it's really understanding what's your intentions, and in that conversation, in that interaction, is the intention at the forefront of your mind? Because often, sometimes it's not. And then we go on to the final part, acceptance. And this looks about implementation and appreciation. And I touched on it a little bit earlier when, you know, finding what can you appreciate, just finding the things that are there rather than what's not. And implementing, because, you know, when you implement, I always say mindset is about implementation. Because when you create little notes for yourself, those little notes and reminders become habits. That habit that you develop over time becomes a lifestyle. But a lifestyle does not happen straight away. So this is really about creating steps, and it's really about understanding, you know, even through this pandemic, creating those steps to move past this pandemic. What does that look like for each individual person? But that's my personal one that I've created. And then I talk about, you know, understanding and turning, you know, understanding your pain, turning it into purpose, and unleashing your power. Now, before I go into messages, I just want to explain what that means. So we've all got pain. We've all been through, you know, different experiences. And in the, you know, in this pandemic, we've all suffered in some form of way, whether it's been, I know people that, you know, have lost people, you know, they've been made redundant. But actually, there's always a silver lining. You know, in this time, there's been so much things that have hindered me, but also there's been so many things that I've learned from it. There's so many things I've grown. And it's like that saying, if you don't go through something, you're not able to really understand, you know, the impact, and actually understand about, you know, I've learned so many things about trauma just in this period because it's bared so much trauma. And it's important that when you're looking at yourself or looking at somebody else that you know that might be close to you, and you're looking at their traumas and you trying to understand and maybe support them, it's really understanding that that person has to understand their pain before you can unleash your full potential. But it starts with awareness, just like the slide where I had the 3 steps. And then in terms of moving on, I always say it really underpins with the messages that's around you. And this is for people that are on here will know that I'm very big on this. And this, you know, there's a saying that you are what you eat. I like to say you are what, you know, the things that are around you. And this comes in the form of our TV, the things we listen to, the social media, the images that surround us, the environment, and the affirmations, the things that we're speaking to ourselves, but also what people are speaking around. Because, you know, I don't know if anyone's ever had this, but you go into a staff room, you know, just to grab your lunch. You feel really happy, the day's gone good. You go into the staff room and it's just, there's nothing, you know, positive going on. When you've left that room, you might not even realize it, but actually you feel a bit down. You feel like, oh, so the one thing that happens, you're now, you know, that's stuck with you. It's infuriated you. And actually it's because of what's around you. You know, in this time, you know, we've all been home, you know, and there's nothing wrong with watching TV and nothing wrong with watching sites. But again, it's just those messages, you know, and I talk about this a lot with young people because they listen to a lot of negative music, and a lot of young people think that it's a way of expressing themselves. But if you want change and all you're doing is surrounding yourself with the same things, you're going to get the same results. And it's really important, really key when we're thinking about moving from our own trauma, what needs to be different? Because actually, if you've watched the same things, listened to the same things, but you're saying that actually I want this opportunity, I want this new thing in my life, what new things do you need to develop? What new affirmations do you need to say? I'm going to talk about questions and harmful questions, because I think that's a key thing, because questions are something we, you know, ask ourselves every day. We ask questions for others, but actually I don't think we realize that some questions are very harmful. You know, in certain affirmations, I know that I've heard this being said to adults, young people, things like, you can't change, it's too deep, Why are you like this? Sometimes when we put a why in a question, it can come across very accusational. And I'm going to show you right here. So sometimes it's really looking about how can you reframe that question. So if you're saying why, can you put a how? Can you put a where? Can you change it? Because it's like that sentence, and you see this in English a lot. You can have the same sentence, but depending on where it breaks, it sounds very different. And it's really important that sometimes, you know, you might have asked a question with the best intent to gather the information you need. But if it's a harsh question, it will prompt a harsh response. And sometimes when we get that harsh response, something I touched on earlier, is what then happens is we then feel like that person's been rude, been a bit confrontational, and then we then get in a harsh response. And again, it's that vicious cycle. You know, and as I said, this is all about awareness. When you're aware, that's when things can change. Just really quickly before I move on, I want you to think really quickly about, you know, in the last couple of weeks, is there a question that you could would have reworded? You know, is there times where you've probably heard somebody, or even you've said it to somebody, where actually that was harmful in terms of the question that you asked? We don't need to share, just to think about it. What I would like to do really quickly is talk about getting support, you know, because support comes in different ways. I always say, you know, I had this conversation a lot where the first thought is, oh, I'm going to get counseling. And you tend to find some people, for some, counseling doesn't work. They've tried it and it hasn't. And there's no right or wrong answer. I always say the key is learning. Learn about yourself, learn about your trauma, how it impacts you, talk, coaching and mentoring. But it's important that when we're looking at getting support from professionals, we're understanding how are they personally trained to help you. And I think that's a key thing, because you can be a counselor, you can be a therapist, you can be a coach, you can be a mentor, but if you're not trained, if you're not equipped to deal, especially when you're looking at the topic of trauma, because there is implications of secondary trauma, but when you're not trained about that, you're not necessarily aware. You know, things to think about in terms of getting support. It's never too late. You're never too old. You're never too young. Don't be scared. A lot of times when we look about getting support, it's because we're too afraid. You know, I always say, give yourself what you deserve, especially our young people. Our young people live in a world that all of this trauma that they're going through is normal. And actually, it's not normal. And actually, do you deserve to achieve your goals? And this goes for anybody, regardless of age. Awareness is key. It starts with a decision. Sometimes we put all different things in place to why we can't get support, but actually make that decision. When you make the decision, everything else falls in place. Now I'm going to end on, you know, I talked about affirmations, and I'm very big on affirmations. It's something I say daily. And I just wanted to, you know, there's a saying that you can't give from an empty cup. So I've got a few here that I'm going to leave you guys with. And you're all amazing. Everybody that you know, whether they've gone through trauma or not, they're amazing. No matter what, you know, the behaviors they display, what is deep and inside there just needs to be unlocked. You know, our dreams are good enough to start or continue. It all starts with a choice. An important thing is hurt people. It's not personal. Sometimes when we're on the receiving end, it feels very personal, but it's not. You know, people don't set out to want to hurt. And then that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well done, Gemma. That was really, really good. I have a little poll that I'd like people to take part in, if that's all right. It's going to pop up on your screen in a moment, and it's multiple choice. There's 5 questions, but I think there's an issue with the last one which says write your comments. I think there was an issue with you can't write a comment. So you need to scroll down and then press submit at the bottom. So I'm just going to launch that now. And this is just to help us with getting feedback on how the events have gone. So I've just launched that now, so you should see it pop up. Well done, Gemma. That was great. How are you feeling?
Yeah, good. I mean, it's such a topic. You know, it's a topic that, as I said, we all go through. You know, life as as I like to call it. But it's really getting people to understand that your life experiences doesn't mean that you're incapable of change, and it really doesn't mean that you can't achieve. You know, and sometimes, you know, even just in this pandemic, you know, it could be someone's been a bit defensive to us and not realizing what's going on up here.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, I think at the end of this, there's going to be a lot of mental filters would have been created. You know, people will jump to conclusions. Oh, someone's coughing. It's a continuous cough. Oh, it's, you know, there's so much there. And I think when we understand that, actually, you know, our relationships and interactions just improve, and they become authentic. They become real. So that's kind of, you know, my aim in terms of when I talk about trauma, to shed light on that.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I think there's a lot going on in the world at the minute, and yeah, definitely lots of people to think about. So yeah, this session was really great, really great. So I'm going to end that there. Thanks again for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Same to everybody else. Thank you guys very much. Take care.
Bye bye.